Hey guys, Brian here from Better Chess Training, and in today's video, I'm going to be showing a nice strategic win by our first world champion, Wilhelm Steinitz. And particular, I'm going to be trying to explain the game more for our beginner viewers and our newer chess players who are just starting to learn strategies. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you found it instructive. Okay, today I'd like to present a game for you. It's actually Emanual Lasker, the second world champion, against Wilhelm Steinitz, the first world championship. And this is from their world championship match in 1894. I'm mainly going to be using, I got this game out of Yasser Seirawan's Winning Chess Strategies. Well, what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be focusing my uh, explanation more on a basic level or a beginner level as opposed to a more intermediate or advanced level, which I do in a lot of my other videos. And so hopefully, if you are new to learning chess strategy and how to get better, hopefully you'll find this helpful. Okay, and let me know in the comments if you do. So here, Steinitz is playing the black pieces, and we're going to put him on the bottom because he's going to be kind of our hero during this match. He's going to be our teacher. And of course, I'm a fan of Emanuel Lasker, as many of you know. And he starts out here with E4. And again, if you're not sure about this, I'll explain what we want to do in the opening is really try to control the center. Those would be these central squares here. And we do that usually using our pawns and our pieces. Okay, and there's different types of openings, and all of them in some way or another try to accomplish this. And so Steinitz responds with E5, which back then that was considered the most principled way of responding to this first move, which is E4. And it's still one of the most popular ways to deal with it today. Knight to f3. So the second principle is to develop our pieces, and especially in the beginning, we want to develop what we call the minor pieces. Those would be the bishops and the knights. The reason why is because they are more powerful than the pawns. I guess they're more mobile, but they are not necessarily as powerful as what we call the major pieces, the rooks, and the queen. So we want to kind of get them out first so that we can kind of see what our opponents are up to without committing our heavy pieces, which can become a target for attack later and also have maybe more long range capabilities that can be used later. So we don't necessarily need to put them out on the front. Okay. So knight to c6, protecting this pawn because white was threatening to capture it with the knight. By the way, I am assuming that you know how the pieces move, so I'm not going to go over every the rules on how the pieces move, and instead focus more on the strategy and the tactics. Okay, so white follows up here with bishop to c4, and again following our principle of trying to uh, develop our pieces, and specifically develops this bishop because at some point in the future he wants to tuck his king away by castling, and that would be our third principle, which is to keep our king safe. Okay, black responds here with bishop to c5, and this was one of a very common way to develop as well. Also, starting to develop these pieces on the king's side so that we can castle. And as you may know, we can castle both ways, but often it is preferable to castle on the king's side. Because there's times when you're not going to do this, but uh, often is the case where it is better to do this. Okay, d3 is played, and here white is protecting this pawn here as well as this bishop, and also now this bishop here, the dark squared bishop, can move. Okay, black develops a knight as well as prepares to castle here. Okay, white plays knight to c3, first developing a knight. Very straightforward. Good castle here as well. So there are different, as you get better at chess, you're going to be studying these different opening sequences and learning specific ways to counter them. But this is a nice general way of developing, getting your pieces out, and then deciding what your strategy is going to be a little bit later. As you learn more about chess, the way you develop your pieces will help to determine that strategy. Okay, and black plays here d6, protecting the e5 pawn again, but now also this light square bishop can uh, move. Okay, now here we have sort of our first major confrontation between pieces. Black develops his bishop on e3, and it is now in contact with this bishop here on c5. And of course, if black were to do nothing, white can capture this bishop. Now, of course, black can also capture back. And so let me show you something real quick here. And let's just say I'm just going to make a move like, let's say black castles here. Then uh, white can capture this bishop, and then when black captures back, material, which is how many pieces are on the board, is still equal, but now we have a change in what we call the pawn structure. And specifically, these two pawns are now what they call doubled, and this can be both good and bad. Right now, it has positive aspects as well as negative aspects. Some of the positive aspects are that it helps to control this d4 square, which can become maybe a what they call an outpost for a knight. This can be both good and bad, so you want to recognize both aspects of these pawn structure changes. Okay, but let's go back to the game. That wasn't played. Instead, black played something else. Now, I also want to point out, in general, black does not want to take here on e3 unless he has to. For example, if he takes here, then again, he does double these pawns, but now he's got a little more central control, kind of helping to protect d4, as well as this pawn on e3 can support if at some later point white wants to advance this pawn to take up more space. Okay, so what did black do instead? Let's take a look. So here's back at the game, and here black plays bishop to b6, and this is a standard move in this type of opening. And the idea here is that if white now takes here, it really helps black because it does double these pawns. But again, as I mentioned, there are positive aspects to it. And here we can see that now this rook becomes more active, where before it didn't have very much room. Now it has plenty of room, and there's really no way for white to take advantage of any structural defects of these pawns. Okay, so let's go back. After bishop to b6, white played queen to d2. So, of course, that protects the bishop here. It also allows white to castle either queenside or kingside. Now, Lasker, again, he was one of the best players, and of course, he became world champion after this match. But he liked to be flexible, and a lot of modern masters today as well you don't need to castle right away. Now, as a beginning player, I would encourage you to castle earlier than later, but both players tend to want to see what the other is doing before they commit their king to one side or the other. Okay, knight to a5 is played, attacking this bishop here on c4. Okay, and so white avoids having his bishop taken with this check here, with bishop to b5 check. Now, you can avoid check in a few ways. You can move the king. You can block with a move like bishop to d7. A little worse, I think, would be something like knight to d7. But black here blocks with the pawn here on c6. So, not wanting to have his bishop taken, white backs up to a4. And here, uh, black plays move that I told you not to play earlier, which is bishop takes e3. Now, before I explain why, I want you to maybe pause the video and try to figure out what white's threat is and why black took on 3. So go ahead and pause the video and try to figure that out, and then I'll show you in a few seconds. Okay, well, the reason why black took on e3 is because there is a threat here, and it is this to play b4. And as you can see here, if we look at all of the squares where the knight can go, they are covered. So black wanted to give his knight a place to escape. So he takes on e3, and after white takes back with e3, and again, white takes back with the pawn instead of with the queen because he wants to have a little more control here in the center. Also, this f file, after he castles, will be available for his rook here. So after f takes e3, then black plays e5, attacking the bishop, and now this knight can escape back here. Okay, white plays his bishop to b3. And here, queen to b6. And so now for the next few moves, and this is where the discussion of strategy comes in. So once you've developed your pieces and you've gotten them out, you want to start thinking about what to do in terms of fighting against your opponent. And here, what black is doing is targeting this pawn on e3. And here you can see it is protected by the queen. So black is not going to be able to necessarily win the pawn if white defends it. But by attacking it, he is keeping white busy, so white cannot, the white pieces, the white side cannot do his own plans. Okay? So here, white castles, and black follows up with a very good move, which is to play knight to g4, targeting this pawn. Now, white has enough in order to defend it. So there's a further point behind this, which I'll show you shortly. First, I do want to point out the reasoning behind this. Hear this first, is that on the white side of things, white's position actually seems pretty solid. After he's castled, this rook can become very dangerous here, especially combined with this bishop. So targeting this f7 pawn, this square. So part of this reason behind playing knight to g4 was not only to target this e3 pawn, because both of them are good players. He's not going to be able to win this pawn right away, but instead to move this knight out of the way so he can deal with this potential threat against his f7 pawn. So let's see what happened. White easily defends this e3 pawn, and now black plays f6. And this was one of the reasons why we had to play knight to g4 first. Now, as you see here, the pawn now, having advanced, shuts out this rook for a little while. Remember, the rooks are worth a lot more than these pawns. So By advancing it, it removes it from being targeted by the white bishop. It also blocks this rook from entering. Okay. Now this position is about even, by the way, and that's where strategy comes in. As beginner, you're going to be playing your opponents, and you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Your opponents are going to make a lot of mistakes. But once you get past making really big mistakes, you need to start to think about how you should move your pieces. And so that's what we're talking about. That's what strategy is. It's what to do when if your opponent doesn't make a huge mistake, learning how to move your pieces. Okay, h3 is played, and this simply attacks this knight here on g4, and so the knight goes back to h6. Now, as we can see, these knights here are on the edge of the board, and there's a principle in chess called the knight on the rim is dim, or uh, that is kind of a catchphrase. And the knights on the edge of the board aren't always, sometimes they're not very strong because they only cover 4 squares instead of the 8 squares because they're on the edge of the board. However, they can, from here, it's usually just a stopping point to go somewhere else. For example, this knight can travel from here to here eventually and become very strong. Or similarly, this knight can come back here and maybe do some type of long path over here. So the idea when you see these masters play these moves is that this isn't the last spot where he's going to put the knight, but that's where he has to put it right now. Okay, knight to d2 is played, and could be a few reasons for this, but one common plan in this type of position is to play the c3 pawn up and to play this d4 pawn up to sort of attack black center as well as take up space. Okay, so knight takes b3. So instead of retreating, he's trading pieces, and that's another area of uh, strategy in itself. Knowing when to exchange pieces, and there's a lot of reasons to exchange pieces. Sometimes you want to get rid of one of your opponent's dangerous pieces. Sometimes you want to clear space so that you can move another piece or a pawn. Sometimes it is to trade down so that you can simplify the position and handle the resulting position a little more easily. Those are just a few of the reasons, and of course we'll cover these as we move forward. In this case, this white bishop is somewhat annoying, and so by getting rid of it, black gets rid of a potential threat, and now this increases the strength of his own bishop. If you can take a look at this position here, you can see now all of these squares can be controlled by our own bishop. And later, as we'll see in the game, black is going to use the structure here. And let me just move this forward one. So black is later going to use the structure and attack it with his pawns by advancing here. So we'll see that in a little bit. Okay, black castles, and this again gets his king out of danger here. See, in the middle, you can see eventually these pawns might advance and get exchange, and it's going to open up these lines here towards the king. So we wanted to make sure that we tucked our king away. So that's what Steinitz does here. Okay, this knight goes to g3, and here it is doing a few things. It's covering the f6 square, which might get opened up here by the pawn. Also, this knight might hop onto f5 at some point itself. Okay, so here black starts that strategy of opening things up on the side. And one aspect of play that you want to start thinking about is what side of the board you want to play on. And do you want to try to attack the king side or do you want to try to attack the queen side? And if you want to use the logic of the position to help you determine that, the general idea is you want to try to push the action where you think you can gain an advantage. So this might be an area where you have more pieces concentrated. This might be an area where you have more space. In this case with black, he sees these slight disfiguration on the queen side of white and wants to be able to create either a pass pawn or open up some lines for his pieces. So that's why he pushes this pawn forward to a5 to start that attack. Okay? Okay, so white, as we mentioned before, supported by this e3 pawn, pushes e4. And black now, again, reroutes the knight in order to defend. White places queen to f2. And here, the rook gets played to a7. Now, I was looking at this earlier. There's no notes on why this move is made. And there's a lot of reasons. You can see this type of move in some situations. And I think the general idea is that at some point in the future, if these pawns get exchanged, uh, these heavy pieces by white might come attacking here down the f file. So I think this move is sort of a what they call a prophylactic or a preventative move to bring this rook here to protect f7 and maybe line it up here on f7 to fight against these pieces here. Okay, this rook comes to d1, and the idea here is that if white does open up d file by capturing here, this rook will be ready to invade. Okay, well, kind of letting white dictate things in the middle, black decides to attack on the queen side. Because really here, let me just go back one, um, taking any action by black isn't really very effective. And let me show you just a couple examples. For example, if black were to take on d4, then he takes d4, gives white a nice little center here. And now also these pawns here can become weak as well. So here white has a nice center. Remember, controlling the center is always a principle, and it pretty much throughout the game until the end game usually. Um, and also gives white what we call space. Okay, you can see here that white's pawns are further advanced than black's, so white controls a lot more space, and you can see these pieces can move behind these pawns more easily than black's because there's less room. Okay, and that's just a general principle, of course. Similarly, uh, doing something like here, with um, attacking with this pawn doesn't work either because after d takes e5 and um, something like f takes e5, then e takes d5. For example, c takes d5. Now we can see here there's a lot of danger. For example, knight takes e5. We cannot take this knight. For example, if we take here, then it's simply checkmate here with queen takes f8. Okay, so going back to the game position, that's why black just uh, leaves this center alone, just waits for see what white will do here, and instead continues with his work on the queen side. So a4 is played, and here white advances this pawn because, again, taking here on a4 will just benefit black. For example, if he takes here, now this rook is controlling here, and takes here with the pawn. This is pretty nice too because now these pawns become exposed, and black's pawn here can become very dangerous very quickly in order to promote at some future point. So advancing it to try to lock this up, what he did, and here he plays queen to c7. Now here's the idea behind this move. Uh, black wants to play his pawn up to c5 to break up these pawns and give him these two strong pawns here on the queen side. But if he does it now, show you what happens. he does it at this point, then uh, the exchange doesn't quite work out so well. So you take c5, and then if we take back here, then d takes e5 can be dangerous. For example, f takes e5, and again we have this move knight takes e5, and we cannot take this knight. So that can become um, very dangerous. And then if we take here, uh, we have a little trick here, because knight takes e5, and look at this. We cannot take this knight because, again, that checkmate threat. So why does he play queen to c7? Well, now this queen is protecting this pawn on e5. So later, and let me just make a move here for white just to show you an example. I'm sorry about that. Let's see. So let me just make a quick move here by white. Now we can play this c5 move, and then if that same sequence happens here, we take back, and then we take here. Now we can take back with the knight, because if knight takes e5, then queen takes e5. So the queen is needed here on c7 to protect here. Now that's a little bit, maybe a little bit more advanced, but I did want to explain why he made this little move, queen. Okay, white plays knight to e1, and here that c5 pawn comes out. Okay, well, white doesn't want to take it because, as I mentioned before, not so great, not such a great move. So the queen comes here to d2, protecting these two pawns. Okay, so white brings the bishop over. And here is interesting because I actually think that black is provoking white's next move. Here, white plays d5. I think that just plays into black's hands, because now he just drops his bishop back, and if we can see here, remember, white was kind of, all of his action was here in the center, but by locking these pawns up, now there's nothing we can do. We can't open these lines up anymore, so these pieces here essentially get shut down pretty quickly. Well, if we remember, what was black trying to do? Black was trying to play on the queen side, and so now black can focus here because he's locked this center up. So I think when he played this bishop to e6, it was a little tricky. I mean, it was trying to get a little more action here on this diagonal, but he wasn't worried at all about d5, because he kind of gets what he wants, which is no more central play by white, and so now all of the action is here on the queen. Okay, rook to a1, so white tries to defend here on the queen side, and now black takes here on 4. Okay, white takes back with the queen, and here we can see now this nice little battery. Black lines up his queen and his rook to attack the c2 pawn. Can't do it right away because this knight is protecting it, but it's always like a little pressure that the black has to watch out for. Okay, white brings his queen back, and now we bring the queen up. And here we're going to be putting pressure on this pawn as well. Okay, rook to f2, adding another defender here to c2 so that this knight can move. And here we are again attacking this pawn, now with two pieces, the queen and the knight, and right now there's only one more defender. So what does white have to do? He tries to trade queens, but also, more importantly, has to add another defender. 4. Okay, so instead of capturing, okay, now capturing this queen would not be a great idea. Let me show you why. If queen takes d3, then g takes d3, and now first there's no more target here, and now I think black still has a little bit of an advantage here because he has these two pawns against the one pawn on the queen side, which could be better later in the game. But now white has some what we call counterplay. Okay, now he has some potential action here. He can push this at some point. These rooks can come here at some point, and uh, black is kind of in control of the game. So black does not want that to happen. So let's go back here, and instead of this, he just lines up his uh, rooks here, adding another defender. Now, if white were to take here, for example, that's not what happened in the game. Instead, he played h4. If he were to take here, now these two rooks would be incredibly dangerous to attack the 4 pawn, as well as putting pressure on the c4 pawn. And you can see, compared to the white rooks, are much more active. So instead of that, white attacks this knight. We have these two defenders here. So we want to do something, get rid of this attacker before or black can continue an attack on the e4 pawn. And so black is forced to retreat the knight 7. Okay, now he takes here on c4. Black takes on c4 and trying desperately to get this rook active. But you can see here it's very difficult because of this locked center. Black has control. So this is called a semi-open file. Open file would be, there are no open files in this particular game, but the semi-open file is where there's one pawn, a pawn from one side, but not on the other side, so that these rooks can attack that pawn. So you can see this is a semi-open file, this is a semi-open file, and this is a semi-open file. And typically in those cases, you want to put your rooks on those files to try to attack those targets. Okay, keep moving here. G6. Now, this move seems like a kind of an insignificant move, but the main idea is to cover these two squares so that this knight cannot jump onto there, okay? So just sort of a little defensive move. King to f2. So Lasker, this is heading towards the end of the game, and remember, at the beginning of the game, you want you to tuck your king away, keep your king safe. Now, as we're moving towards the end of the game where there are less pieces on the board, there's less danger for the king. Now we can bring it back to the middle, and that's what Lasker is doing. Okay, this knight tries to find a better spot to go. And here, b3 is played. So we're trying to, white's trying to get some activity, trying to force the action a little. And hopefully he's thinking that maybe he can draw this game in the end game after he trades off some pieces. So black retreats his rook, and white brings his rook over. Now let's just take a quick look here. And what would happen if white were to take here on e4? And we simply take here with the b pawn. And this is an important point here. Now, this is what is called a passed pawn. Okay, it's isolated. It's by itself, so it's called an isolated pawn, which sometimes can be good, sometimes can be bad. But it's also a passed pawn, meaning that besides the pieces, there are no pawns that can capture it or block it. So it has a clear path to promotion, which can be very significant later in the game. Okay, so white wanted to avoid that. So that's why we don't capture on a4. So instead, he brings his rook down here to the first rank. That way it can kind of help to defend along first rank. Okay, remember, this knight is covering this pawn. So black, the knight and the pawn, in general, are not as valuable as a rook. So black doesn't necessarily want to trade his rook for pieces. Okay, so black just bringing his knight over. Sometimes in these games, especially when the center is all locked up, you have time to maneuver your pieces, especially the knight, which takes a little longer to get around. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're using the knights. If the center is blocked, you can find the best square for the knight. For example, here we're not quite sure where this knight is headed, but it can go a lot of different places, and black is taking time to set that up. Okay, so the rook comes here to the d file, and here again, at some point, maybe can open this up, and this rook will become more active. Okay, black plays king to f7, simply bringing the king a little more active for the end. King to e2. Uh, White wants to bring his king over to the king side, or I'm sorry, to the queen side to kind of defend these pawns, as well as to centralize for the end game. And here, rook to a8. Now here, the idea is we want to get our rook behind this pawn, and maybe in the future potentially push it. Okay, so white plays king to d2, now protecting this pawn, and he's pretty much saying I'm ready for the end game. Now we don't want to push this pawn too early because I'll give you an example here. If black pushes this too early, then it can become a really big target here. Uh, White would play b4, shutting this knight out, and then can attack this pawn. So we don't want to do that. Instead, uh, black brings his knight here to um, a5, and there's no immediate threat, but there's just sort of a, we can take here maybe, and just sort of annoying, it being annoying. Okay, and at some point, if this b pawn moves, he can hop onto here, onto c4, and be very annoying. Okay, okay, king to d3, and I think part of the reason here is sort of in reaction to this knight. If this knight comes here with check, then white has to deal with it. So he just puts his rook here, or his king here on d3 to avoid any weird little checks. Okay, h5 is played, and actually this is kind of an important move, just shutting down all of white's counterplay here on the king side, because he really wants to focus his forces on the queen. Okay, the rook comes to a2, and here again, keeping flexibility, either rook can transfer to the other in order to set up what they call a battery. Okay, this rook comes here to a7, and the idea here is that now we are thinking of doing this capture here on b3, and we want to make sure that there's no discoveries here by the rooks. Once we captured this, we want to make sure that both rooks are protecting each other. Okay, b4 is played. Seeing that um, there's no real threats here with this capture, and that black can start to think about this capture soon. White pushes b4. Part of that is to prevent the b pawn from advancing and supporting the a pawn. So it's really preventing this a pawn push. But there's a downside to it, and it's that it allows this knight to hop onto c4. And now we see this is what they call an outpost. And what makes it a good outpost is that there's no pawns that can attack it and drive it away. The only thing that can attack it is either a rook, which is typically worth more, or another knight, which has about an equal value depending on the position. So it's a much stronger place for this knight to be. Okay, knight comes over, and with the idea of eventually coming here to challenge this knight. Okay, now that the rook's work is done here on the a file, because we're not going to be moving these pawns anytime soon. We're going to move this rook somewhere where it can be useful. Okay, knight to d2, and here we don't want to take this knight. Okay, the reason why, remember, when we talk about trading, there's specific reasons to trade, and here we would be trading a more valuable knight for a less valuable one. Okay, why is it less valuable? Because it doesn't have many squares it can go to. It cannot go to the c4 square because we're covered by the pawn. It can't go here to b3. Okay, whereas this knight can hop back onto c4 if we want. Okay, and also if need be, went from b6, maybe travel back over here to the king side. So this knight can be very useful. And so Steinitz chose not to trade it and just retreated it to b6. Okay, rook to f1. Again, white now is just struggling for some type of activity. Black has seized control of the game, and this is something that I found very interesting when I was a beginner. Is I always mainly focus on how many pieces each side had, and here you can see the material, how many pieces are on the board are the same. But because of certain factors in the position, for example, we have this passed a pawn, we have this very superior knight, we have these knights are pretty much shut down, and we have a lot of flexibility for these rooks, um, and we have targets. Black has a lot of positional advantages, which will make it much easier to win the game. Okay, um, Black lines his rooks up against this pawn here. So it ties down this rook and the king to protect it. Okay, white brings his knight back, probably thinking he wants to advance this pawn to c3 and maybe get some type of play against the b pawn, but not sure if that's exactly possible. Okay, the king moves over here, basically gets out of the way of this rook, which is lined up along here. Okay, c3 is played, and I think white wants to do this so that this rook is not tied down to defending it. But we can bring our knight back to this square. Okay, now here white finally has his own threat with threatening this pawn on f6. But black has a brilliant way to counter this. And again, I would encourage you, if you want to pause the video, and I'll give you a couple clues here. If you don't want the clues, pause the video right now. Okay, and the clue here is that uh, sometimes we want to defend. So one option is to defend this pawn here with something like rook to f8. But sometimes we want to come up with a threat of our own that is bigger. Okay, and here this is based actually on the this c3 pawn being weak, and somehow uh, removing one of the defenders of this pawn so that we can attack it. So that's your clue. So go ahead and pause the video. I'll give you a 5 seconds, and then I'm going to tell you what Steinitz played. Okay, so here, and this may have been a little tricky, but I wanted to give you a chance in case you found it. Uh, Here, Steinitz played the brilliant knight to a3. Now, at first, it seems like we're just giving up the knight. For example, knight takes a3. But we can see very soon that this is very dangerous. Now we only have one defender of the c3 pawn, and it's the king. So rook takes c3 check, and um, just a lot of bad options here. For example, king to e2, and then simply rook takes a3. And then if we take here on f6, we have this bishop to g4 check. And if the king goes to f2, then we can just take here. And if the king tries to go somewhere like e1, rook to a1 check, again, uh, we'll lose. After king to f2, we take here on f1 first with check. King takes, and then we take this one, and we have much more material. Finally, in this position, if white tries to put his king on d2, we have um, rook to a2 check, and if we go to d3, this is eventually going to lead to checkmate after we bring this rook over, and uh, eventually this king is going to get checkmated. Let's go back. So instead of taking on a3, let's say, what happens if the rook takes on f6? By the way, when you're studying these games or when you are studying your own games, you want to analyze these positions and kind of do the what ifs. That's a really great way to improve your chess. So if he takes on f6, well, we just take here on b1 first. Okay, so we're ahead in material, and now white can't take this knight because this knight would then be hanging or be able to be taken. So let's say the rook checks us. Well, we have to go to d8, okay, not to e8. Okay. By the way, if we did go to e8, then that would very bad for us because rook to f8 check, king to e7, and rook 1 to f7 would be checkmate. But we go to d8, after this check, this bishop can block. And here, Bloyd has nothing better than to take here. And then we have here, again, this check on c3. Rook to c3 check, king to d2, rook to c2 check, king to e1. And at the very least, there might be other moves here. Rook takes g2 is going to win more material, as well as keep this pressure up as we look at moves like bringing this rook over here, king to e7, attacking this rook. This knight is threatened. This is totally winning for black. Okay, so that was Steinitz's big move here, knight to a3. So Lasker, of course, very good, avoided all of those. He played knight to e2, but from here on out, it's pretty straightforward. So you're going to take here on b1. But white has to take back. And now we're going to, remember, we have two defenders, right? Two defenders of c3. So now what black wants to do is take here on e2 so that he can capture here again. So you can see how the strategy is about bringing, attacking targets and just building up your forces, not just making one move attacks, unless you're doing that in order to serve a greater strategy. Okay, and how do you learn all of this? Well, you try it out in your games, of course, but just studying these games of these masters, especially these older, the early world champions, were really the pioneers of these strategies, and we're able to see them in the games very clearly here. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, rook to c1, adding that second defender. And here, white just plunks his rook here on c4, just anchoring it. Pretty much, it's almost over here. Rook to c2, and then finally f5, and basically what black is going to break through here. Let me just show you a couple variations. For example, if white were to take, then this bishop check would be very deadly. Try to block it, and we get checked here, and after this king, take this rook, for example. Okay, so that would be one example. Go back. Let's see, if white tries to defend here, for example, then we can just attack this rook. Okay, and if rook to c1, bring the bishop over here, and soon we'll be able to take here. Okay, really not much more resistance. For example, if white takes, we have rook to g4 attacking this knight, and look, this knight is just running out of square. Okay, knight to f1. I'm just giving you a few examples here. Bishop to c4 check. This king moves. Now we just take this. Rook takes. You have rook to g2 check. Okay, so here after f5, Lasker threw in the towel. Now he had the last laugh in the end. He does win this match eventually, but in this particular game, our first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz played very well, played very logical, strategic chess, piled up his pieces on his opponent's targets, and eventually Lasker wasn't able to hold on anymore. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. This video was especially dedicated to more beginning players out there, and I think in the future I might do maybe shorter videos just explaining little bits and pieces of strategy and tactics for beginners. But I wanted to show you also, it's important to see a whole game occasionally, see how from the beginning of a game to the end of a game, how our best players in the world, our former world champions and other legendary players, how they handled the game, and we can pick something up from them. So I hope that you guys found that helpful. Let me know what you know in the comments. I also want to just do a quick thank you to my patrons. Your support is very inspiring, as well as very helpful as I make these videos. So if you want to continue, consider supporting the channel, check out patron link down below. And hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.